The autumn wind carried the scent of pine and fresh-cut wood across the valley as Emma Catherine Walsh hefted another log into place. Her hands, once soft and accustomed to needlework and piano keys, were now calloused and strong. Sweat dampened her brow despite the cool mountain air, and strands of dark blonde hair had escaped from the braids she'd tied that morning. She stepped back, examining her work with a critical eye. The cabin was taking shape, slowly but surely, one log at a time. It had been 8 months since she'd arrived in Montana territory with nothing but a land claim, her late father's carpentry tools, and a determination that burned fiercer than any forge. Emma was 26 years old, unmarried, and according to every person she'd left behind in Boston, completely out of her mind. Ladies didn't homestead alone. Ladies didn't build their own cabins. Ladies certainly didn't venture into wild territory where bears outnumbered people and the nearest town was a 2-hour ride away. But Emma had never been particularly good at being a lady in the way society expected. And after watching her father waste away from illness, after sitting in that suffocating Boston parlor listening to her aunt's endless lectures about finding a suitable husband, she decided that she'd rather take her chances with bears. She didn't know she was being watched. James Thornton sat astride his gray mare on a ridge about 200 yards away, partially concealed by a cluster of aspens whose leaves had turned gold with the season. He'd been watching her for 3 days now, though he'd never admit it to anyone. Not watching in a threatening way, he told himself. Just observing. Making sure she was safe. This was rough country, after all, and a woman alone faced dangers that went beyond wild animals. That was what he told himself, anyway. The truth was more complicated. James was 34 years old, a widower for the past 3 years, and the father of 2 children who were currently staying with his sister 40 miles east while he worked his ranch. He'd lost his wife Catherine to childbirth fever, and the baby girl had followed her mother within a week. The grief had nearly destroyed him. For 2 years, he'd moved through life like a ghost, doing what needed to be done for his surviving children but feeling nothing, caring about nothing, just existing in a gray world where joy seemed like something that happened to other people. Then one day, riding the boundary of his property, he'd seen her. The woman from back east with the determined set to her jaw and the impossible dream of building a homestead alone. He'd watched her fell her first tree, a task that had taken her the better part of a day. He'd watched her drag logs with a team of oxen she clearly didn't quite know how to manage. He'd watched her sit by her campfire at night, exhausted and probably aching, but always back at it the next morning. She never quit. No matter how hard the work, no matter how many times something went wrong, she just kept going. And somewhere in watching her stubborn persistence, James had felt something crack open in his chest. Something he'd thought had died with Catherine. Emma positioned another log, using a rope and pulley system she'd rigged to help lift the heavy timber. Her father had taught her the basics of carpentry, had let her work alongside him in his workshop when other fathers were teaching their daughters to embroider. He'd always said she had an eye for structure, for seeing how things fit together. She hoped he was right because this cabin had to last through a Montana winter, and she had no margin for error. The log slipped as she was maneuvering it, nearly crushing her foot. She jumped back with a yelp, her heart hammering. That was the 3rd close call this week. She was tired, she realized. Bone-deep tired in a way that sleep didn't quite fix. But she couldn't stop. Winter was coming, and she could already feel it in the morning frost, in the way the animals were growing their winter coats. "Ma'am, you're going to kill yourself doing that alone." Emma spun around, her hand instinctively going to the pistol at her hip. A man sat on horseback at the edge of her property, his hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm. He was tall, she could tell even mounted, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face weathered by sun and wind. His eyes were a startling blue, and there was something kind in them, though also something sad. "I'm managing just fine," Emma said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "And this is private property." "I know. I'm your neighbor, James Thornton. My ranch is about 5 miles northeast." He gestured in that direction. "I've been meaning to introduce myself, make sure you knew you had help nearby if you needed it." "I don't need help." A small smile played at the corner of his mouth. "I can see that. Dette sia fine pulle I system you've got there. Your design." Despite herself, Emma felt a small flush of pride. My father was a carpenter.
He taught me.
He taught you well. James dismounted, moving slowly so as not to spook her. His mare began grazing peacefully, unconcerned. But even the best carpenter would have trouble raising a cabin alone. It's not a matter of skill, just physics. Some jobs need more than 2 hands. Emma wanted to argue, but the log that had nearly crushed her foot 15 minutes ago was evidence he was right. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Thornton, but I can't pay you. Every penny I have is going into supplies for winter. Didn't ask for payment. He walked closer, examining her work with an expert eye. You've got a good foundation here. The notching on these logs is clean.
You know what you're doing.
Then why do I need your help? He looked at her directly then, and Emma felt something shift in the air between them. Because accepting help isn't the same as admitting weakness. And because I remember what it's like to be stubborn enough to do everything alone, even when it's harder that way. There was a story there, Emma could tell. Pain in those blue eyes that spoke of loss and loneliness. She recognized it because she'd seen similar shadows in her own mirror. One day, she found herself saying, "You can help me today, and we'll call it neighborly courtesy. But I'm building this cabin myself, Mr. Thornton. That's important to me." "James," he corrected gently. "And I understand. How about I help you with the heavy lifting, and you do all the skilled work? That way it's still your cabin." They worked together through the afternoon, and Emma was surprised by how easy it was. James was strong, capable of lifting logs she'd struggled with, but he didn't take over. He followed her instructions, asked her opinion, treated her like a partner rather than someone who needed to be managed. They fell into a rhythm, her directing and doing the precision work while he provided the muscle for the heaviest tasks. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, they'd raised 4 more courses of logs. More progress than Emma had made in the previous week. "You should go," Emma said, wiping her hands on her work dress. "It'll be dark soon." James nodded, but he seemed reluctant to leave.
He could come back tomorrow.
"If you'd like. I've got some time before I need to get back to my ranch." Emma should say no. She should maintain her independence, prove she could do this alone. But looking at the cabin taking shape, at how much further along she was than she'd been this morning, practicality won out over pride. "That would be acceptable," she said, trying not to sound too eager. James's smile was genuine this time, reaching his eyes and erasing some of that sadness.
"He'll bring breakfast."
"You look like you've been living on hardtack and coffee." "I'm a terrible cook," Emma admitted. "My aunt in Boston used to despair over it."
"Lucky for you, I'm not. Catherine, my wife, she."
He paused, the smile fading slightly. "She taught me before she passed. Said a man with children needed to know his way around a kitchen." "You have children?"
"2.
"A boy, Samuel, he's 7. And a girl, Margaret, she's 5. They're with my sister right now while I handle things at the ranch." He looked away, toward the darkening mountains. "They need a home. A real home, not just a place to sleep. They need—" He trailed off, but Emma understood what he couldn't say. They needed a mother. They needed a family whole again. And he needed someone to share the burden of grief that still weighed on his shoulders. Over the following weeks, James came every day. Sometimes he brought his children, and Emma found herself charmed by Samuel's serious questions about how buildings stayed standing and Margaret's endless chatter about everything and nothing. The little girl would pick wildflowers and bring them to Emma, calling her Miss Emma in a sweet voice that made Emma's heart ache. The cabin grew steadily. Walls rose, the roof went on, windows were fitted into place. Emma had designed it with 2 bedrooms, thinking ahead to a future she hadn't quite dared to imagine in detail. James noticed but said nothing, just built according to her plans. They talked while they worked. James told her about his life, about growing up in Missouri, about coming west with Catherine to build a new life, about the joy of his children's births and the devastating loss of his wife. Emma shared her own story, about growing up as the disappointment daughter who preferred her father's workshop to the drawing room, about the suffocating expectations of Boston society, about choosing freedom and hardship over comfort and constraint. Don't you get lonely? James asked one afternoon as they were chinking the walls with moss and mud. Emma considered the question honestly. Sometimes. Especially at night when the wolves are howling and the wind is hitting the canvas of my tent. But I'm less lonely here alone than I was in Boston surrounded by people who wanted me to be someone I'm not. I understand that. James was quiet for a moment. I was lonely even when Catherine was alive, toward the end. She was slipping away, and I couldn't help her, couldn't save her. Felt like I was alone even when I was holding her hand. Emma reached out and touched his arm, a gesture of comfort.
I'm sorry.
He covered her hand with his own, calloused and warm. Me too. But lately, I've been feeling less lonely. Working here, talking with you. It's been good. Their eyes met, and Emma felt her breath catch. There was something building between them, as surely as they were building this cabin. Something neither of them had been looking for but both desperately needed. The first snow came in late October, light flurries that melted by noon. The cabin was nearly finished, just some interior work remaining. Emma stood inside her new home, marveling at what she'd accomplished. What they'd accomplished, she corrected herself honestly. James was outside, loading his tools onto his horse. He'd been quieter today, and Emma sensed something was weighing on him. James! She stepped out onto the porch she'd insisted on having. Is something wrong? He turned to face her, and the longing in his expression took her breath away. Emma, I need to ask you something, and I need you to know I'm not asking because I think you need saving or because you can't make it alone. You've proven you can do anything you set your mind to. Her heart began to race. What are you asking? My children need a mother. I need. He stopped, started again. I've been alone for 3 years. I thought that part of my life was over. Then I watched you building this cabin, so determined and brave and stubborn, and I felt something I thought was dead wake up again. He took a step closer. I'm asking if you'd consider building a different kind of life. With me. With my children. I'm asking if you'd marry me. Emma's mind raced. This was what she'd fled Boston to escape. Marriage, domesticity, losing herself in someone else's life. But James wasn't offering that. He'd watched her build a cabin alone and hadn't tried to take over. He'd raised his children to respect her independence. He was offering partnership, not ownership. I won't give up this land, she said firmly. This is mine. I wouldn't ask you to. And I'm still a terrible cook. A smile broke across his face. I'll teach you. Or I'll do the cooking. I don't care. And your children? What if they don't want me? Emma, Margaret has been begging me to ask you to come live with us. Samuel thinks you're the smartest person he's ever met. They already love you. Emma looked at her cabin, at the home she'd built with her own hands. Then she looked at James, at this man who'd watched her build it and had offered his strength without trying to take her independence. She thought about Samuel's curious questions and Margaret's sweet smile. She thought about nights that wouldn't be quite so lonely and days filled with purpose beyond mere survival. Yes, she said, the word coming out stronger than she'd expected. Yes, I'll marry you. James crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, pulling her into an embrace that felt like coming home. And as Emma stood there in front of the cabin she'd built log by log, held by a man who saw her strength rather than her defiance, she realized that independence didn't mean being alone. Sometimes it meant being strong enough to choose partnership. The cabin would stand through the winter and many winters after. And it would be filled not just with shelter, but with family, with love, with the sound of children's laughter and the warmth of a man who'd been longing for exactly what Emma had been building all along. A place to belong, a reason to hope, a future worth constructing one piece at a time.